They say a parent's duty is to support their child's dreams, no matter how impossible they seem. I used to believe that until the day my 14-year-old son Mason announced his college ambitions at our family reunion, and the people I call family laughed right in his face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. We had just finished lunch, barbecue ribs and sweet tea, my father's traditional summer spread. The air smelled like charcoal and freshly cut grass. The patio buzzed with conversations about property values and vacation plans. My sister Vanessa was already showing off photos of her daughter's modeling portfolio, her third professional shoot this year. My father beamed at her like she'd discovered the cure for cancer. I sat at the edge of the lawn with Mason, both of us half hidden in the shade of the old maple tree. Always am during these family gatherings. I've learned to stay quiet, stay invisible, and just get through it. Vanessa had just finished passing around her daughter's glossy headshots, designer jeans ads, and a magazine spread that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Everyone clapped and praised her parenting skills, her daughter's natural talent, her incredible foresight to start her early in the industry. I could feel Mason shift beside me, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. The same notebook he'd been scribbling in for months, researching universities, scholarship requirements, and programs for aspiring physicians. "Go ahead," I whispered to him. "It's okay." He stood up slowly, nervous but determined, and walked toward the center of the patio. "I've been thinking about college," he said. His voice cracked a little, but he smiled anyway. "I want to become a neurosurgeon, and I've been researching the pre-med programs at Johns Hopkins and Stanford." My Uncle Dale looked at him like he'd just announced he wanted to be a professional unicorn hunter. Aunt Patricia gave a tight smile and muttered something about setting realistic expectations. But then Vanessa, my beautiful, successful, golden child sister, let out a loud laugh. "You'll need straight A's for those schools," she said, nudging my father with her elbow. "Guess fantasy is cheaper than reality. Better start looking at community colleges, buddy." The patio laughed, not loudly, but loud enough. My face flushed. I looked at Mason, who was still standing there, still holding his notebook like a shield, like he hadn't heard the jab. And then my father, Richard, the patriarch of the family, the judge and jury of everything I've ever done wrong, took his shot. He looked at Vanessa, then at me, and said, "Well, what did you expect? Her boy takes after her. All dreams, no substance." The gathering fell quiet for a second, not out of shock, out of familiarity. That's how he talks to me. That's how he's always talked to me, like I'm a disappointment that somehow failed him just by existing. And I wish I could tell you that I stood up and said something brave, that I defended my son and myself with power and grace. But the truth is, I froze. Because when you're used to being talked down to, humiliation starts to feel normal. It sinks in so deep you almost forget you deserve anything better. I turned to Mason, ready to make an excuse for us to leave, but he beat me to it. He held out his notebook, walked right up to my father. "I made this research document for you too, Grandpa," he said, offering a printed packet that peeked from inside his notebook. "I calculated the scholarship opportunities and financial aid options. I know it's a long shot, but I'm willing to work for it." My father blinked, clearly not expecting that. His fingers curled around the papers like they were something he wasn't sure he wanted to touch. He flipped through the first page, and then he stopped. Just stopped. His smile disappeared. His posture stiffened. The same man who had called my son's dreams unrealistic seconds before now stood frozen, silent, staring at a collection of papers with highlighted statistics and carefully researched information. You could hear the sprinklers kick on in the neighbor's yard. No one spoke. Not Vanessa, not Uncle Dale, not Aunt Patricia. I didn't know what Mason had included in that research packet, but whatever it was, it silenced the patio. And for the first time in years, my father had nothing to say. Family gatherings used to be my favorite time of year. When I was a little girl, before the disappointments began, I used to believe in the togetherness, the laughter, the idea that love and acceptance were just waiting around the corner in a paper plate of potato salad. That illusion disappeared by the time I turned 16. Now, family reunions feel like an interrogation room, a time for my family to quietly measure my failures against my sister's endless list of achievements. And every year, I show up with my son, Mason, hoping for peace, preparing for judgment. We always gather at my father's house in Brookfield, Connecticut. It's the same sprawling colonial I grew up in, with a manicured lawn, painted shutters, and a flagstone patio that's more for entertaining business associates than for family comfort. The house always looks immaculate, like a magazine spread. Pristine gardens with not a leaf out of place, outdoor furniture arranged just so, a BBQ grill that probably costs more than my car payment for 6 months. The moment I pull into that circular driveway, I feel 15 again, awkward, inadequate, and bracing for impact. My father, Richard, doesn't believe in pleasantries. He believes in making statements that leave marks. He greets me with firm handshakes and comments like, "Still wearing your hair like that?" Or, "The Toyota's making that noise again? Should have bought American." I usually just nod. I've learned there's no winning with him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then there's Vanessa, my younger sister by 2 years. She's everything my dad ever wanted in a child. Successful, beautiful, confident to the point of arrogance. A marketing executive for a luxury brand in New York with a perfect smile, a perfect husband who works on Wall Street, and 2 perfect children who already have modeling portfolios before they've finished elementary school. She never arrives without stories of her latest achievements, lavish family vacations in the Maldives or ski trips to Aspen. She likes to make a show of it, pretending it's casual. She also likes to remind me how lucky I am that Dad still invites me to family gatherings, as if it's charity. I bring one thing to these reunions. Mason, my 14-year-old son, my reason for breathing. He's the reason I haven't completely cut ties with my family. He deserves memories, traditions, connections with family, however flawed they might be. And despite everything, he's always intrigued by the idea of family. He doesn't see the judgment. He only sees the possibility of belonging, of connection, of what family is supposed to be. This year, I knew Mason was particularly excited. Not about the reunion itself, but about sharing his dreams. For months, he'd been obsessed with neuroscience, staying up late reading textbooks, watching lectures online, filling notebooks with research about universities and medical programs. When I found him at 2 a.m. on a school night, eyes red from staring at his laptop, I sat beside him. "Sweetheart, what's got you so wrapped up?" He looked up, almost startled, like he'd forgotten where he was. "Mom, did you know the human brain has 86 billion neurons, and each one can form connections with thousands of others?" His eyes lit up, the kind of pure passion I remember having once, before life and family ground it down. "I want to understand it all," he continued, scrolling through university websites. "I want to help people with brain injuries and diseases. I want to be a neurosurgeon." I felt pride swell in my chest, followed immediately by dread. Medical school, hundreds of thousands in student loans, years of schooling and residency, all, while I was still trying to make ends meet as a single mother working as a physical therapist in a small practice. We lived comfortably, but there was never anything extra. No college fund growing steadily for Mason's future. I took a breath. "That's incredible, Mason. It's a long, difficult path, but if anyone can do it, you can." He smiled, that crooked smile that always makes my heart ache with love. I know it's hard, Mom. That's why I'm researching scholarships and financial aid. I've got spreadsheets and everything. Of course he did. Mason was nothing if not methodical. While other kids his age were obsessed with video games and social media, my son was creating study schedules and researching academic competitions he could enter. As the family reunion approached, he grew more excited. "I'm going to tell everyone about my plans," he announced one evening as we drove home from his academic decathlon practice. "I've prepared a whole presentation. Maybe Grandpa will have some advice. He knows people, right?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Mason, honey, maybe we should wait. Your grandpa might not—" "He's always talking about ambition and goals," Mason interrupted. "I want to show him I have both." I didn't have the heart to tell him that my father's definition of ambition was very specific. It meant following his path: business, finance, tangible success you could measure in square footage and luxury, car models. Not the uncertain path of academic pursuits with no guaranteed payoff, and especially not from me, the daughter who disappointed him at every turn. My father had made his fortune in commercial real estate development. He built shopping malls and office parks across the Northeast, accumulated wealth through shrewd investments and, from what I'd observed growing up, an ability to intimidate anyone who stood in his way. He expected his children to follow a similar path to success. Vanessa had done exactly that. She'd gone to the business school he selected, taken the corporate job he approved of, married the man he deemed worthy. I, on the other hand, had pursued a degree in physical therapy against his wishes. Glorified massage, he'd called it when I announced my major. And when I'd gotten pregnant with Mason during my final year of college, he'd looked at me like I'd confirmed every low expectation he'd ever had of me. The father of my child, a fellow PT student named Elliot, had stuck around just long enough to see Mason born before deciding fatherhood wasn't for him. He'd moved to California for a job opportunity, sent child support payments reliably but impersonally, and visited exactly twice in 14 years. I'd raised Mason alone, built a modest career, created a home filled with books and curiosity and love. But none of that registered as success in my father's ledger. To him, I would always be the daughter who settled for less, who didn't have the drive to reach higher. 2 days before the reunion, I tried one last time to prepare Mason. We sat at our small kitchen table, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. We'd hung with plants that Mason carefully tended. "Honey, I want you to be prepared. Grandpa and Aunt Vanessa. They might not react the way you hope when you tell them about medical school." Mason looked up from his notebook, brow furrowed. "Why not? It's a good career. Doctors make good money if that's what Grandpa cares about." I sighed. How do you explain toxic family dynamics to a child who still believes in the basic goodness of people? It's complicated. Sometimes people have very specific ideas about what success looks like. And sometimes, I hesitated. Sometimes people find it easier to dismiss dreams than to support them. Mason considered this, tapping his pencil against his chin the way he always did when he was processing information. That's not logical. If someone works hard enough, they can achieve almost anything. The statistics show. This isn't about statistics or logic, I interrupted gently. It's about perception and bias. And sometimes, I swallowed hard. Sometimes it's about me. His eyes narrowed. What do you mean? How could I explain that in my family? Anything associated with me was automatically suspect. That my father had written me off years ago, and by extension, had limited expectations for my son? Just be prepared for them to be skeptical, I finally said. But know that I believe in you completely. He nodded, returning to his notebook. I've prepared for skepticism. That's why I have data. Facts are hard to argue with. I smiled. At his innocence, his faith in reason and evidence. My beautiful, brilliant boy still believed that merit would win out over prejudice. Part of me wanted to protect that belief a little longer. Another part knew the reunion might shatter it completely. The morning of the reunion dawned bright and clear. Mason was up early, reviewing his notes, wearing his good outfit, khaki pants and a button-up shirt I'd bought him for a school presentation. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he'd even polished his glasses. He looked older than 14, more serious, like he was heading to a job interview instead of a family BBQ. "Ready?" I asked, car keys in hand, stomach already knotting with anxiety. He nodded, clutching his notebook. "Ready." The drive to Brookfield was quiet. Mason reviewed his notes, occasionally sharing facts about Johns Hopkins medical program or the research opportunities at Stanford. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to quell the growing sense of doom. When we pulled up to my father's house, I could already see Vanessa's Range Rover in the driveway, alongside my Uncle Dale's Mercedes and several other expensive vehicles. My 10-year-old Toyota looked like it had taken a wrong turn and ended up in the wrong neighborhood. Mason didn't seem to notice. He was too busy gathering his papers, checking that everything was in order. I watched him, this child who had somehow grown up without inheriting my insecurities or my father's arrogance. How had I managed that miracle? "Remember," I said as we walked to the door, "no matter what anyone says, I'm proud of you." He smiled. "I know, Mom, but I think they'll be impressed. I've done a lot of research." The door opened before we could ring the bell. My father stood there, tall and imposing even at 70. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his polo shirt crisp, his khakis pressed. "You're late," he said by way of greeting. I checked my watch. We were 5 minutes early. "Hello to you too, Dad." He stepped aside to let us in, giving Mason a brief nod. "Everyone's out back." The house was just as I remembered. Spacious, immaculate, more like a museum than a home. Everything in its place, nothing personal or warm. The kind of house featured in architectural magazines, but lacking any evidence that actual humans lived there. We followed my father through the house to the back patio, where the rest of the family was gathered. Vanessa was holding court near the grill, gesturing animatedly while a group of relatives laughed at whatever story she was telling. Her husband James stood nearby, expensive sunglasses perched on his head, drink in hand. Their children, Olivia and Ethan, were showing off gymnastics moves on the lawn, supervised by a young woman I assumed was their nanny. "Look who finally made it," Vanessa called out, waving us over with a manicured hand. I gave a weak smile. Mason gave a small wave. My father stepped past us to join the group by the grill, immediately engaging in conversation with my Uncle Dale as if we'd never arrived. Vanessa approached, air-kissing both my cheeks. "Emma, you look tired, teaching aerobics to seniors. Must be exhausting." "I'm a licensed physical therapist at a rehabilitation center," I corrected, the same correction I gave every time. "And I'm fine, thank you." She turned to Mason. "And how's my favorite nephew? Still buried in books?" Before Mason could answer, she continued. "Olivia just booked a national commercial, you know, and Ethan's been selected for an elite soccer program. We're flying to Europe next month so he can train with some professional coaches." "That's great," I said automatically. "Congratulations to both of them." Mason nodded politely. "That sounds like a great opportunity." Vanessa beamed, clearly pleased with the acknowledgement of her children's accomplishments. "It is. We're so proud. Of course it's expensive, but James just made partner, so—" She waved her hand dismissively, as if the cost of flying to Europe for children's extracurricular activities was a minor inconvenience. I nodded, unsure what response she expected. Envy? Amazement? Whatever it was, I didn't have the energy to provide it. Mason shifted beside me, his notebook clutched tightly against his chest. I could feel his anxiety radiating off him in waves. He was working up the courage to speak, to share his dreams with this audience that had already decided what kind of person he was based solely on being my son. The afternoon progressed predictably. We ate my father's perfectly grilled steaks and gourmet side dishes prepared by his housekeeper. We listened to stories of Vanessa's vacations, Uncle Dale's golf tournaments, and Aunt Patricia's charity committee work. No one asked about our lives. No one seemed to notice Mason growing, increasingly quiet beside me. As dessert was being served, some fancy Italian gelato my father had special ordered, Mason finally stood up. His chair scraped against the flagstone, causing several heads to turn. "I'd like to say something," he said, his voice steadier than I expected. The conversations around the table didn't immediately stop. My father continued discussing property values with Uncle Dale. Vanessa was showing something on her phone to Aunt Patricia. Mason cleared his throat, louder this time. "Excuse me, I'd like to share something with everyone." This time, they noticed. The table quieted, all eyes turning to my son, standing there with his notebook clutched in both hands, his knuckles white with tension. And that's when it happened. The moment that would replay in my mind for weeks to come. The moment that changed everything about how I saw my family, my son, and myself. "I've decided what I want to do with my life," Mason announced. "I want to become a neurosurgeon." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before my father let out a short, dismissive laugh. "A neurosurgeon? That's quite an ambition." Mason nodded earnestly. "Yes, sir. I've been researching the path, pre-med undergraduate, then medical school, residency, and fellowship. It's approximately 14 years of education after high school." Vanessa exchanged a look with her husband, eyebrows raised. "That's a lot of student loans, buddy. Maybe aim for something more. Attainable?" "I've researched scholarship opportunities," Mason continued, opening his notebook. "Johns Hopkins and Stanford both have excellent pre-med programs with financial aid options. I've calculated that with my current GPA and extracurricular activities, I have a reasonable chance at—" "Johns Hopkins?" my father interrupted, setting down his fork with a clink. "Stanford? Do you have any idea how competitive those schools are?" "Yes, sir," Mason replied, his voice still steady despite the growing tension. "The acceptance rates are below 5%, but with strategic application approaches and a strong—" Vanessa cut in with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, sweetie, those schools are for the top students in the country, the ones who've been groomed for Ivy League since preschool." "Like Olivia and Ethan," James added helpfully, gesturing to their children who were now absorbed in their tablets by the pool. I felt my face grow hot, my hands clenching under the table. But still, I said nothing. Years of conditioning to stay small, to avoid confrontation, kept me silent even as I watched my son being systematically dismantled by the people who should have been encouraging him. Mason flipped a page in his notebook. "I understand the competition is intense. That's why I've already joined academic decathlon and science Olympiad. I'm also volunteering at the hospital this summer to gain clinical exposure." My father leaned back in his chair, studying Mason with a look I knew too well. It was the same look he'd given me when I'd announced my plan to become a physical therapist. A mixture of pity and dismissal, as if the very audacity of having dreams beyond his approval was somehow pathetic. "Mason," he said finally, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he used in business meetings. "It's good to have goals, but there's a difference between ambition and fantasy. Do you know what the average neurosurgeon makes?" "Approximately $600,000 per year, depending on location, specialization, and years of experience," Mason answered promptly. My father raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting such a specific response. "And do you know what it costs to become one? The hundreds of thousands in student loans? The years of living like a pauper during residency? The malpractice insurance alone—" "Richard," my Aunt Patricia interjected softly, "he's just a boy with a dream." Exactly, my father replied, emphasizing the word boy. A boy from a single-parent household with limited resources. A boy whose mother works at a— He waved his hand vaguely in my direction. Therapy center. Be realistic. That's when Vanessa delivered the final blow. She looked at Mason, then at me, then back at my father. Well, what did you expect? Emma's always filled his head with these unrealistic ideas. She did the same thing herself. Remember when she thought she'd become a physical therapist to professional athletes? Now she's helping old ladies walk after hip replacements. The table laughed, not maliciously, but with that knowing tone that suggested they'd had this conversation many times before when I wasn't present. The sound of it made my skin crawl. I opened my mouth, finally ready to defend my son, to tell them all exactly what I thought of their narrow-minded assessment of what was possible. But Mason spoke first. "I have something for you, Grandpa," he said, pulling out a neatly stapled packet from his notebook. "I thought you might have these concerns, so I prepared this." He walked around the table and placed the document in front of my father. It's a comprehensive breakdown of the financial pathways to becoming a neurosurgeon, including scholarship statistics, loan repayment programs, and the projected return on investment over a 40-year career span. My father stared at the packet, clearly surprised by its professional appearance. The cover page had a graph, color-coded and neatly labeled. He flipped through the first few pages, his expression unreadable. Mason continued. "I've also included case studies of successful neurosurgeons who came from backgrounds similar to mine. Single-parent households, limited financial resources, public schools, people who made it through hard work and determination." He paused, looking around the table. "I know the odds are against me. I've calculated them precisely. But I've also calculated that with maximum effort and strategic planning, those odds can be improved by approximately 27%. The patio fell silent. My Uncle Dale leaned forward, suddenly interested. Aunt Patricia adjusted her glasses, peering at the packet in my father's hands. Even Vanessa looked momentarily speechless. My father flipped through another page, then another. His brow furrowed as he studied a particularly detailed chart. Finally, he looked up at Mason, who was still standing beside him, waiting. "You put this together yourself?" he asked, his tone different now. Less dismissive, more assessing. Mason nodded. "Yes, sir. It took approximately 3 weeks. I consulted with my school guidance counselor and interviewed 2 medical school admissions officers via email." My father made a non-committal sound, returning to the document. I could see his expression shifting, that familiar look he got when evaluating a business proposal. Calculating, measuring, reassessing. I held my breath, watching this interaction unfold. My son, standing tall beside the man who had just laughed at his dreams. My father, suddenly confronted with evidence that perhaps he had misjudged. And something changed in that moment. A shift so subtle you might miss it if you weren't looking for it. My father set down the packet and looked at Mason. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. "This is thorough," he said finally. Coming from Richard Harrington, that was practically a standing ovation. Mason remained standing as my father continued to examine the packet, turning pages with newfound interest. I watched, barely breathing, as the mood around the table shifted from dismissive amusement to something resembling curiosity. 14 years of schooling, my father mused, more to himself than anyone else. That's a significant commitment. "Yes, sir," Mason replied. "But broken down into achievable milestones, it's manageable. I've outlined the progression on page 7. My father flipped to the indicated page, where Mason had created a detailed timeline from high school through fellowship training. Each phase was color-coded, with bullet points noting key objectives and potential obstacles. Uncle Dale, never one to be left out of a conversation, leaned over my father's shoulder. "Mind if I take a look at that, Richard?" My father passed him the packet without comment, his eyes still fixed on Mason with an intensity I hadn't seen before. It wasn't approval, not yet, but it was assessment, the kind he usually reserved for business associates or investment opportunities. "Where did you get these statistics?" Uncle Dale asked, adjusting his reading glasses. "Multiple sources," Mason answered promptly. "The Association of American Medical Colleges, the National Resident Matching Program, and interviews with current medical students and residents. I cross-referenced everything for accuracy." Aunt Patricia looked up from her dessert. "You interviewed medical students? How did you manage that?" "Email and virtual meetings," Mason said. "I reached out to 47 people. 12 responded. I compiled their insights in Appendix B." I watched my family's faces as they processed this information. The dismissive smirks had faded, replaced by expressions ranging from mild surprise to genuine interest. Even Vanessa seemed momentarily at a loss for a cutting remark. "May I?" James asked, holding out his hand for the packet. Uncle Dale passed it over, and soon most of the adults at the table were trying to get a glimpse of Mason's work. My son stood there, patient and composed, answering questions with a confidence that made my chest swell with pride. "The debt-to-income analysis is particularly thorough," James commented, sounding impressed despite himself. As a financial analyst, he couldn't help but appreciate the level of detail Mason had included. My father cleared his throat, reclaiming everyone's attention. "This shows initiative," he said carefully. "But a plan on paper isn't the same as execution. Your academics would need to be impeccable, not just good, exceptional." Mason nodded. "I'm currently maintaining a 4.0 GPA. I've already started studying for the SAT, though I won't take it until next year. My preliminary practice tests place me in the 95th percentile." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "And extracurriculars?" "Top schools want well-rounded students, not just academic robots." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross Mason's face. Sports had never been his strong suit, and we both knew that the kind of prestigious activities that impressed admissions officers, international volunteering, summer programs at elite universities, were financially out of reach for us. "I'm focusing on activities related to medicine," he said after a brief pause. "Hospital volunteering, science Olympiad, and I've applied for a summer internship at the university research lab." My father made a non-committal sound. "Competitive, but not impossible. Still, the financial burden." "I've calculated that too," Mason said, reaching for his notebook again. "If I receive partial scholarships and work part-time during undergraduate years, the student loan burden would be approximately—" "Loans," my father interrupted, saying the word like it tasted bitter. "A lifetime of debt." Mason's shoulders stiffened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "The average debt for medical school graduates is $200,000. With the average neurosurgeon's salary, that can be repaid within 10 years using income-based repayment strategies, while still maintaining a comfortable standard of living." My father leaned back in his chair, studying Mason with narrowed eyes. I recognized the expression. It was the same one he wore when considering a particularly risky investment property. Weighing potential against probability, calculating the odds of success versus failure. "And what happens if you don't make it?" he asked bluntly. "If you wash out of pre-med or don't match into neurosurgery? It's a pyramid scheme, you know. Thousands enter, only dozens reach the top." The question hung in the air, heavy and challenging. I wanted to jump in, to shield Mason from the harsh reality my father was forcing him to confront. But before I could speak, Mason answered. "Then I adapt," he said simply. "I've researched alternative pathways. If I don't match into neurosurgery, There are other specialties I find intellectually stimulating. If I don't get into medical school on the first try, I can strengthen my application and reapply. If medicine proves unattainable, my pre-med foundation would still qualify me for careers in research, healthcare administration, or biotechnology. He paused, then added, "The goal is to become a neurosurgeon. But the broader objective is to work in a field where I can apply scientific knowledge to help people. There are multiple paths to that outcome." I stared at my son in amazement. When had he developed this level of maturity, this capacity for strategic thinking? While I'd been worrying about protecting him from disappointment, he'd been quietly preparing for all contingencies. My father was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something I didn't expect. He closed the packet, set it down carefully on the table, and looked directly at Mason. "You've clearly given this considerable thought," he said, his tone neutral but not dismissive. "I'd like to review this more thoroughly. Perhaps we could discuss it further after I've had time to examine the details." It wasn't an endorsement. It wasn't even encouragement. But from my father, it was something close to respect, an acknowledgement that Mason's dream, while ambitious, wasn't simply childish fantasy. Mason nodded, solemn and a little surprised. "Thank you, sir. I'd appreciate your input." The conversation gradually shifted to other topics as dessert was finished and coffee was served. But something had changed. The usual pattern of our family dynamics had been disrupted, if only slightly. My father kept glancing at Mason's packet, which remained beside his coffee cup. Uncle Dale asked Mason a few questions about his research methods. Even Vanessa seemed less eager to redirect attention back to her own children's accomplishments. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself watching my son interact with my family in a way I'd never seen before. Not as my tag-along child, not as the poor relation to be pitied or ignored, but as a person in his own right. Someone with ideas and ambitions worthy of consideration. When it was time to leave, my father walked us to the door, something he rarely bothered to do. As we stepped onto the porch, he turned to Mason. "You can email me if you have questions about the financial projections," he said, his tone businesslike. "I may have some suggestions for improving your analysis." Mason's eyes widened slightly. "Thank you, Grandpa. I will." My father nodded, then turned to go back inside. But before closing the door, he paused and looked at me. "He's got your determination," he said, his voice gruff. "But he's more strategic than you were at his age." I wasn't sure if it was criticism or compliment. With my father, the line was always blurry, but it was acknowledgement, and that in itself was rare. The drive home was quiet at first. Mason stared out the window, watching the upscale neighborhoods of Brookfield give way to the more modest surroundings of our hometown. "You were amazing," I finally said, breaking the silence. "The way you handled all those questions, the research, you did. I'm so proud of you." He turned to me, his expression serious. "Do you think Grandpa was right about the odds being against me?" I considered my answer carefully. I wanted to be supportive, but I also didn't want to lie. "The path you've chosen is difficult, yes. There will be obstacles, some of them financial, some academic. But difficulty isn't impossibility." I reached over to squeeze his hand. What I saw today was a young man who doesn't just have dreams, but has the foresight and discipline to map out a path to achieve them. "That's rare, Mason. That's special." He nodded, absorbing my words. Grandpa didn't laugh at the end. He actually listened. "Yes, he did," I said, still somewhat amazed by that fact. "You know why? Because you didn't just tell him what you wanted. You showed him you understood what it would take to get there." Mason was quiet for another moment. "Mom, why does Aunt Vanessa always try to make you feel bad about your job?" You help people walk again. That's important. The question caught me off guard. I'd always tried to shield Mason from the complexities of my relationship with my sister, the constant comparisons, the subtle digs disguised as concern. Some people measure success differently than we do, I said carefully. For your aunt and grandfather, it's about status, money, prestige. For me, it's about meaning and impact, even if it's on a smaller scale. Like helping Mrs. Feldman walk her daughter down the aisle after her stroke? Mason asked, referring to one of my patients whose recovery had been a particular point of pride for me. I smiled, touched that he remembered that story. Exactly like that. We drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Mason spoke again. I'm going to do it, Mom. I'm going to become a neurosurgeon, not to prove Grandpa wrong or to make Aunt Vanessa stop smirking, but because I really want to understand how the brain works and how to fix it when it's broken. I glanced at him, this incredible young person I'd somehow helped create. I believe you will. And in that moment, I truly did believe it. Not just as a mother's blind faith in her child, but as a rational assessment of the determination I'd witnessed that day. When we got home, Mason disappeared into his room to update his research based on the questions he'd received. I sat at our small kitchen table, replaying the day's events in my mind. For years, I'd approached family gatherings with a mixture of dread and resignation, steeling myself for the inevitable reminders of my perceived inadequacies. I'd taught myself to expect dismissal, to anticipate judgment, to prepare for the subtle and not-so-subtle ways my family would make me feel less than. But today, something had shifted. Not because I'd finally stood up for myself, I hadn't. Not because my family had suddenly developed empathy, they hadn't. But because my son, with his meticulous research and calm persistence, had commanded a respect I'd never managed to achieve. And in witnessing that, I'd seen my family through new eyes. Not as the all-powerful arbiters of worth I'd allowed them to be for so long, but as people with limited vision, confined by their narrow definitions of success. My phone pinged with a text message. To my surprise, it was from my father. Mason's research is impressive. Has he considered summer programs at Yale? Could open doors. Let me know if he's interested. I stared at the message, reading it twice to make sure I'd understood correctly. My father, who had laughed at Mason's ambition just hours earlier, was now offering to help. Another ping. He reminds me of myself at that age, determined, detail-oriented, not easily discouraged. I sat back, stunned. In all my years, I couldn't remember my father comparing anyone favorably to himself. It was the highest compliment he was capable of giving. I showed the messages to Mason, who read them with wide eyes. Yale has summer programs for high school students interested in medicine, he said, immediately pulling out his laptop to research. But they're expensive, several $1,000s. Your grandfather wouldn't have mentioned it if cost was an issue, I said, still processing this unexpected development. I think he might be offering to help. Mason looked up from his computer, his expression a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Why would he do that? He didn't seem to believe in me earlier. I considered the question, trying to understand my father's abrupt change in attitude. I think you surprised him, I said finally. People like your grandfather are used to being the smartest person in the room, the one with all the answers. You came prepared with information he didn't have, statistics he couldn't immediately dismiss. You spoke his language, facts, figures, return on investment. So he respects me now because I use spreadsheets? Mason asked, his tone slightly skeptical. I laughed. Partly, yes, but also because you demonstrated something he values above almost everything else: thorough preparation. You didn't just have a dream, you had a plan. In his world, that makes all the difference. Mason nodded slowly, absorbing this insight. Should I thank him For offering to help with the Yale program? Yes, I said, but don't sound too grateful. With your grandfather, respect is earned through strength, not gratitude. Mason raised an eyebrow, looking suddenly older than his 14 years. That's a weird way to relate to people. Yes, I agreed. It is. Over the next few weeks, something extraordinary happened. My father began emailing Mason regularly, not just about the Yale summer program, which he did offer to finance, but about medical school admissions strategies, connections he had at various universities, even articles about breakthroughs in neuroscience that he thought might interest. Mason. It was as if a door had opened between them, one that had remained firmly closed to me throughout my life. My son and my father were developing a relationship independent of me, built on a foundation of mutual respect that I had never experienced with either of them. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of me was thrilled for Mason that he had found a champion in his grandfather, someone with resources and connections who believed in his potential. Another part felt a complicated mixture of jealousy and resentment. Why had my dreams never received this kind of support? Why had my ambitions always been deemed insufficient? One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Mason looked up from his computer where he'd been drafting an email to my father. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, setting down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables. "What did you want to be when you were my age, before you became a physical therapist?" The question caught me off guard. I paused, thinking back to my own adolescence, the dreams I'd had before practical considerations and family expectations had narrowed my path. "I wanted to be a marine biologist," I said finally. "I was fascinated by ocean ecosystems, especially coral reefs. I used to check out every book in the library about ocean life and watch nature documentaries for hours." Mason looked surprised. "I didn't know that. Why didn't you pursue it?" I sighed, returning to my chopping. "Many reasons. Your grandfather thought it was impractical. Too much education for too little financial return. We lived in Connecticut, nowhere near the ocean. And when I mentioned it to my guidance counselor, she suggested I consider something more suitable for a young lady." "That's sexist," Mason frowned. "It was the 90s. I shrugged. "Things were different then. Not better. Just different." "So you became a physical therapist instead?" "Not immediately," I admitted. "I started college as a biology major, thinking I might find my way to marine science eventually. But then I took an anatomy course and became fascinated with how the human body moves and heals. After I injured my knee playing intramural soccer, I spent 6 weeks in physical therapy and realized I'd found my calling." "Do you regret not becoming a marine biologist?" Mason asked. I considered the question seriously. Sometimes I wonder what that life would have been like. But no, I don't regret becoming a physical therapist. I've helped hundreds of people regain function and independence. That's meaningful work. Mason was quiet for a moment, processing. "Grandpa seems to think your job isn't important enough." The observation stung, but I couldn't deny its accuracy. "Your grandfather measures value primarily in terms of income and status. By those metrics, my career isn't particularly impressive, but there are other ways to measure a life's work. Like helping Mrs. Feldman walk her daughter down the aisle," Mason said, echoing our earlier conversation. "Exactly," I smiled. "Or helping Mr. Rodriguez recover enough hand function to play guitar with his grandchildren again. Or teaching Sarah Miller how to navigate the world after losing her leg in that car accident." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's why I want to be a neurosurgeon. Not just because it's prestigious or well paid, but because the brain is so essential to who we are. Helping someone recover from a brain injury means giving them back their identity." I looked at my son, struck once again by the depth of his thinking, the clarity of his purpose at such a young age. "That's a powerful motivation," I said. much more meaningful than status or money. Do you think Grandpa understands that part of it? Mason asked. I hesitated. I don't know. Maybe not yet, but you might be the one who helps him see it. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Mason's questions lingered in my mind. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I found myself pulling out an old box of memorabilia from my college days. Inside were course catalogs, notebooks filled with lecture notes, and a brochure for a semester abroad program in marine ecology that I'd once desperately wanted to attend but couldn't afford. I ran my fingers over the glossy photos of students in wetsuits, examining coral reefs off the coast of Belize. What would my life have been like if I'd found a way to make that dream happen? If I'd had someone in my corner, championing my ambitions the way my father was now championing Mason's? It was a pointless exercise in what-ifs, but I couldn't help wondering if my father's newfound support for Mason was, in some small way, an acknowledgement of how he'd failed me. Or was I giving him too much credit for self-awareness he'd never demonstrated? Either way, I was determined that Mason would have what I hadn't, the freedom to pursue his dreams without being undermined by the very people who should be supporting him. The summer arrived, and with it, Mason's acceptance to the Yale Discover to Cure high school internship program, a prestigious opportunity for students interested in biomedical research. My father not only paid the program fee, but also arranged for Mason to stay with a colleague who lived near the Yale campus, saving us the long daily commute. The day before Mason was to leave for the program, my father called and asked to speak with him. I handed over the phone, watching as Mason's expression shifted from nervousness to surprise to a cautious sort of pleasure. Yes, sir, he said several times. I understand. I'll make the most of it. When he hung up, he looked slightly dazed. What did he say? I asked. He said this program could be a turning point, Mason replied. That the connections I make might open doors all the way to medical school if I impress the right people. He gave me advice about how to network with the professors. I nodded, unsurprised that my father would focus on the strategic advantages of the program rather than the educational experience itself. He also said, Mason hesitated. He said he's proud of me for having a clear vision and the discipline to pursue it, that it's a rare quality in someone my age. The words hit me like a physical blow. In 37 years, I couldn't recall my father ever saying he was proud of me. Not when I graduated with honors, not when I established my practice, not even when I raised Mason alone after his father left. I forced a smile. He's right to be proud. You've worked incredibly hard. Mason studied my face, more perceptive than I sometimes gave him credit for. Are you okay, Mom? Of course, I said quickly. Just a little emotional about you going away for the summer. It'll be quiet around here without you. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he let it go. I'll call every day, and it's only for 6 weeks. I know, I said, pulling him into a hug. And it's going to be an amazing experience. I'm so proud of you. As I held him, I tried to focus on the positive. This was a remarkable opportunity, one that could indeed be a stepping stone toward his dream career. The fact that it came through my father's influence was irrelevant. What mattered was that Mason was being given chances I'd never had. Yet I couldn't completely silence the small, hurt voice inside me that wondered why my own father had never seen in me what he so readily recognized in my son. That evening, as Mason packed his clothes and organized his notebooks for the program, my phone rang. It was my father again. Emma? He said when I answered, his voice brisk as always. Is Mason ready for tomorrow? Yes, I replied. He's been packing and preparing all day. Good. I've spoken with Dr. Levinson, the program director. He'll be keeping an eye on Mason, making sure he gets the most out of the experience. Of course he had. My father never missed an opportunity to leverage his connections. That's thoughtful of you, I managed. There was a pause, uncharacteristic in our usually efficient conversations. Emma, he said finally, his tone different. Somehow, less certain. I want you to know that I recognize what you've done with Mason. Raising him to be focused, academically driven. It's impressive. I nearly dropped the phone. In all my adult life, I could count on one hand the number of times my father had paid me a direct compliment. Thank you, I said, when I'd recovered enough to speak. Another pause. Perhaps I was wrong, he said, the words sounding as if they were being extracted under duress. About some of the choices you've made. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, unsure what was happening or how to respond. Mason is exceptional, he continued, and that reflects on you. Your parenting. It wasn't exactly an apology for years of dismissal and criticism. It wasn't an admission that he'd been wrong to undermine my career choices or life decisions. But from my father it was unprecedented, an acknowledgement, however oblique, that I'd done something right. I appreciate that, I said quietly. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional territory we'd stumbled into. Yes, well, the car service will pick Mason up at 9 tomorrow. Make sure he's ready. And just like that, the moment was over, the familiar businesslike tone restored. But something had shifted, however slightly, in the tectonic plates of our relationship. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, turning the conversation over in my mind. My father's words of approval, as limited and qualified as they were, had affected me more than I wanted to admit. Even at 37, some part of me still craved his validation, still wanted him to see me as worthy. It was pathetic, in a way, but it was also human. We all want to be seen, to be valued, especially by those who have known us longest. What mattered most, though, wasn't my father's belated recognition of my parenting skills. It was that Mason was being given opportunities I'd never had, support I'd never received. My son would not have to fight the headwinds of family doubt and dismissal that had made my own journey so much harder. And perhaps, in some small way, watching Mason pursue his dreams with such clarity and determination was healing something in me too. Showing me that the cycle of limited expectations and withheld support that had defined my relationship with my father didn't have to continue into the next generation. As I helped Mason finish his packing, checking off items on the program's supply list, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in my son, hope for his future, lingering hurt from my own past, and a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, old patterns could change. Tomorrow, Mason would begin his journey toward becoming a neurosurgeon, a path that would be challenging, demanding, and filled with obstacles. But he would face those challenges knowing that, unlike his mother before him, he had people in his corner who believed in his potential, and that made all the difference. The summer passed in a blur of video calls, text messages, and weekends spent driving to Yale to visit Mason. Each time I saw him, he seemed to have grown not just physically, but intellectually. The scientific language he used became increasingly complex, his understanding of neuroscience more nuanced. He spoke of neuroplasticity, axonal regeneration, and gene therapy techniques with the confidence of someone who had found their element. Dr. Levinson, the program director, requested a meeting with me during one of my visits. A distinguished neuroscientist in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he welcomed me into his cluttered office with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, gesturing for me to sit, "I wanted to speak with you about Mason." My heart immediately raced with concern. "Is everything all right?" He laughed, a surprised sound. "More than all right. That's precisely why I wanted to meet. In 20 years of running this program, I've rarely encountered a student with Mason's combination of analytical thinking and genuine compassion." Relief washed over me, followed by pride. He's always been driven, I said. But the compassion, that's what makes me most proud. Dr. Levinson nodded thoughtfully. Many students come here with technical aptitude. They can memorize pathways and understand protocols. But Mason has something more. He doesn't just want to know how the brain works. He wants to understand what it means for the person. He shuffled through some papers on his desk and pulled out what appeared to be a research proposal. Mason developed this during our independent project week. It's a literature review on psychological recovery after traumatic brain injury, specifically focusing on identity reconstruction and family support systems. I glanced at the paper, immediately recognizing Mason's methodical approach in the BAO. Neatly organized sections and color-coded reference system. Most students his age focus solely on the biological mechanisms, Dr. Levinson continued. Mason integrated neuroscience with psychology and social support factors. It's graduate-level thinking. He's always been able to see connections between different areas, I said, trying not to sound like a mother bragging about her child, though that's exactly what I was doing. Dr. Levinson leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Harrington, I don't say this lightly. Your son has exceptional potential. With the right mentorship and opportunities, he could make significant contributions to the field. That means a lot coming from you, I said, genuinely moved. I understand from Richard that financial resources are a concern, he said carefully. I tensed slightly at the mention of my father. Of course he would have discussed our financial situation with Dr. Levinson. We manage, I said, my tone more defensive than I intended. Dr. Levinson nodded, seemingly unbothered by my reaction. I mention it because I want you to know about opportunities that exist. There are specialized high school programs, research scholarships, university pipeline initiatives. Mason's grandfather has been quite proactive in seeking information. I bit back a sarcastic comment about my father's sudden interest in educational opportunities he'd never bothered to investigate for me. What I'm trying to say, Dr. Levinson continued, is that talent like Mason's shouldn't be limited by financial constraints. There are paths forward, and I'd be happy to help identify them. By the time I left Dr. Levinson's office, I had a folder filled with information about programs, scholarships, and mentorship opportunities I hadn't known existed. As I drove back to our modest apartment, where Mason would return at the end of the summer program, I felt a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Pride in my son's achievements. Gratitude for Dr. Levinson's interest and support. Lingering resentment toward my father for the opportunities denied to me but actively pursued for Mason. And underneath it all, a growing sense that Mason's life was about to expand in ways mine never had the chance to. When the summer program ended, Mason returned home changed in subtle but significant ways. He moved with more confidence, spoke with more authority about his interests, and, most noticeably, began referring to my father regularly in conversation. Grandpa says Johns Hopkins has the best neurosurgery residency program, he would mention casually over dinner. Or, Grandpa introduced me to his friend who's on the board at Yale Medical School. Each reference was like a small paper cut, not seriously painful, but irritating. A reminder of a relationship I'd never had with my own father. Yet I couldn't begrudge Mason this newfound connection. For the first time, he had a male figure in his life who was actively interested in his future, who shared his strategic thinking and ambition. After years of Elliot's absence and indifference, Mason deserved that. As summer transitioned to fall, and Mason began his freshman year of high school, my father's involvement in our lives increased steadily. He called weekly for updates on Mason's academics. He sent articles and books he thought would interest Mason. He even arranged for a retired neurosurgeon friend to give Mason a tour of the operating facilities at Hartford Hospital. One Sunday morning in October, my phone rang with my father's ringtone. I answered, expecting the usual brief exchange before he asked to speak with Mason. "Emma," he said, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. "I'd like to discuss something with you, in person." Alarm bells immediately rang in my mind. In our family, in-person discussions were reserved for serious matters, usually problems. "Is everything all right?" I asked. "Yes, yes," he said quickly. "Nothing to worry about. I'd like to invite you and Mason to dinner next Saturday. At the house." Not a restaurant where we occasionally met when my father wanted to see Mason. The house, my childhood home, a place I now visited only for obligatory family gatherings. "Just us?" I clarified, wondering if this was another family event I hadn't been informed about. "Yes," he confirmed. "There's a matter I'd like to discuss with both of you." Curiosity overrode my usual reluctance. "All right, what time?" 7. "I'll have Mrs. Peterson prepare something special." Mrs. Peterson had been my father's housekeeper for as long as I could remember. The fact that he was instructing her to make something special only increased my curiosity. When I told Mason about the dinner invitation, his eyes lit up with excitement. "Do you think it's about the MIT summer program?" Grandpa mentioned he had connections there. "Maybe," I said, though something in my father's tone had suggested a more significant discussion than summer plans. "We'll find out Saturday." The week passed slowly, my curiosity building with each day. By Saturday evening, as we drove through the familiar neighborhoods toward my childhood home, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. My father greeted us at the door himself, rather than leaving it to Mrs. Peterson as he usually did. He was dressed more formally than I expected for a family dinner, in a blazer and pressed slacks. "Emma, Mason," he nodded to each of us. "Come in." The house was exactly as I remembered it, impeccably maintained, tastefully decorated, and utterly impersonal. No family photos adorned the walls, no mementos cluttered the surfaces. It was a showplace, not a home. Yet something was different. Tonight. The dining room table, typically set with my father's everyday china for family meals, was laid with the formal dinnerware I remembered from childhood special occasions. Crystal glasses gleamed under the chandelier light. A bottle of expensive wine was breathing beside my father's place setting. "What's the occasion?" I asked as we took our seats. My father poured himself a glass of wine, then offered me one, which I accepted with surprise. He never served me alcohol in his home, as if I were perpetually underage in his eyes. "I've been doing some thinking," he said, once we were all seated, and Mrs. Peterson had served the first course, a delicate lobster bisque that had been my mother's favorite special occasion recipe. Mason and I exchanged glances. My father was many things, but reflective was not typically one of them. "About?" I prompted when he didn't immediately continue. He took a careful sip of his wine, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Family, legacy, the future." Classic Richard Harrington, vague and portentous. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes, a teenage habit I'd never quite outgrown around my father. "Mason's participation in the Yale program this summer was illuminating," he continued. "Dr. Levinson speaks very highly of his potential." Mason straightened in his chair, clearly pleased by this indirect praise. "It's made me consider what kind of support would be most beneficial for his future," my father said, his gaze shifting between us, "and what I might do to ensure that support is available." I tensed, suddenly alert to where this conversation might be heading. My father had never offered financial support for anything in my adult life, not even when I was struggling as a single mother with an infant and trying to finish my degree. His sudden interest in supporting Mason made me deeply suspicious. "Mason's path to becoming a neurosurgeon will be challenging," he continued. "Competitive undergraduate programs, medical school, residency. Each stage requires not just academic excellence, but strategic positioning." I bristled at his businesslike assessment of my son's future, the reduction of a passionate pursuit to a series of tactical maneuvers. "Mason is more than capable of meeting those challenges," I said. perhaps more sharply than I intended. My father nodded, unperturbed. Yes, he is, but capability alone isn't always sufficient. Opportunities matter. Connections matter. Financial resources matter. I set down my spoon with a small clink against the fine china. Dad, if you're suggesting that I can't provide adequately for Mason's education— That's not what I'm saying, Emma, he interrupted, his tone surprisingly gentle. I know you've done remarkably well providing for Mason on your own. What I'm suggesting is that you don't have to do it alone anymore. The statement hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. My father had never acknowledged, even indirectly, the struggle of raising Mason without financial support from either him or Elliot. This oblique recognition was unexpected. What exactly are you proposing? I asked cautiously. He set down his wine glass and reached beside his chair, producing a leather portfolio I hadn't noticed earlier. From it, he withdrew several official-looking documents. I've established a trust fund for Mason's education, he said, sliding the papers across the table toward me. It will cover his undergraduate and medical school expenses in full, at whatever institutions he qualifies for. It also includes provisions for living expenses, research opportunities, and international study if relevant to his interests. I stared at the documents, unable to fully process what I was hearing. Beside me, Mason had gone very still, his spoon suspended halfway to his mouth. That's very generous, I managed finally, the words feeling wholly inadequate. My father nodded, as if my response was exactly what he'd expected. There's more. I've spoken with several colleagues on university boards. They've agreed to meet with Mason during his high school years to provide guidance and potentially support his applications when the time comes. I felt a complex surge of emotions, gratitude for these opportunities being offered to my son, resentment that they came from the same man who had dismissed my own ambitions, and suspicion about what my father expected in return. Why now? I asked bluntly. You've known Mason his entire life. You've known about his intelligence, his potential. What changed? My father didn't answer immediately. He took another sip of his wine, his expression thoughtful. Several things, he said finally. Seeing his presentation at the reunion, the thoroughness of his research, the clarity of his vision. Hearing Dr. Levinson's assessment of his aptitude, and he hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain, reflecting on past mistakes. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Mistakes? He met my gaze directly. I didn't support your ambitions. The way I should have, Emma. I had a narrow view of success, of what paths were worthwhile. I pushed Vanessa in one direction, dismissed your interests in another. I was wrong to do so. The admission left me speechless. In all my 37 years, I had never heard my father acknowledge he was wrong about anything, let alone something so fundamental as his treatment of his children. Your work as a physical therapist, he continued, it has value I failed to recognize. Mason helped me see that. The way he speaks about your patients, the impact you've had on their lives, it's meaningful work. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back, unwilling to show such vulnerability in this house where emotions had always been treated as weaknesses. So this is, what, atonement? I asked, gesturing to the trust documents. Not exactly, he said, his tone measured. I can't change the past, but I can perhaps do better with the future. Mason has extraordinary potential. I'd like to help him realize it if you'll allow me. If you'll allow me. Another surprise. My father was actually asking permission, acknowledging that this decision was ultimately mine to make. I looked at Mason, who had remained silent throughout this exchange. His eyes were wide, moving between his grandfather and me with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. What do you think, Mason? I asked softly, This is about your future. He considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. I'm grateful for the opportunity, he said carefully, but I don't want it to cause problems between you and Grandpa. My heart swelled with love for this perceptive, compassionate boy who somehow always managed to see the human dynamics beneath the surface. That's not your responsibility, I assured him. The relationship between your grandfather and me has a long, complicated history that has nothing to do with you. I turned back to my father. I appreciate the offer, truly, but I need some time to think about it. He nodded, seemingly unsurprised. Of course. The documents are yours to review. There are no conditions attached to the trust, Emma. No strings. It's for Mason's education, regardless of what institution he chooses or what specialty he ultimately pursues. The absence of conditions was itself telling. My father had never given anything without expectations before. The rest of the dinner passed in somewhat stilted conversation. My father asked Mason about his classes, his science fair project, his volunteer work at the hospital. Mason answered enthusiastically, clearly enjoying his grandfather's undivided attention. I observed their interaction, noting the genuine interest my father showed, so different from the dismissive tolerance he'd exhibited throughout Mason's childhood. When dinner ended, my father walked us to the door. As Mason stepped outside to wait by the car, my father turned to me. Emma, he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. I know this doesn't erase the past, but I hope it might be the beginning of something better for the future. For all of us. I studied him, this man who had shaped so much of my life through his approval or lack thereof. He looked older suddenly, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. I'll think about it, I said again, neither accepting nor rejecting his olive branch. And Dad, thank you for seeing Mason's potential. It means a lot to him. Something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement. He nodded once, and I turned to join Mason at the car. The drive home was quiet, both of us processing the unexpected turn the evening had taken. Are you going to accept? Mason finally asked as we neared our apartment. I sighed, still sorting through my own complicated feelings. I don't know yet. It's a generous offer, and it would create opportunities for you that I can't provide on my own. But, he prompted, hearing the hesitation in my voice, but accepting major financial support from your grandfather would change our relationship with him. He would have a much larger role in our lives, in decisions about your education. Mason nodded thoughtfully. I like talking to him about medical, school, and research. He asks good questions. But sometimes the way he talks about you, he trailed off, seemingly uncertain whether to continue. What about the way he talks about me? I prompted gently. Mason looked uncomfortable. Sometimes he makes comments about how you could have done more with your life if you'd made different choices, about how having me so young limited your options. A flash of anger surged through me. Of course, my father would try to rewrite history, casting my limited life as a result of personal choices rather than his own withholding of support. Does that bother you? I asked, carefully keeping my tone neutral. Mason was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said finally, because he doesn't see how amazing you are, how many people you've helped, how you've done everything by yourself. He paused. And because I know it's not true. You're not limited, Mom. You're the strongest person I know. Tears pricked at my eyes, and this time I didn't try to hold them back. Thank you, sweetheart. We drove in silence for another block, before Mason spoke again. If we accept Grandpa's help, could we set boundaries? Make it clear that he doesn't get to talk about you that way? I glanced at him, surprised and touched by his protective instinct. Yes, we could do that, if we decide to accept. When we arrived home, Mason went to his room to work on a biology assignment while I sat at the kitchen table with the trust documents, reading through the legal language with growing amazement. The trust was indeed generous. More than generous. It was comprehensive. Tuition, room and board, books, research opportunities, conference attendance, even professional memberships. Everything Mason would need to pursue his dream without financial constraints. And true to my father's word, there were no obvious conditions. No requirements that Mason attend specific schools or pursue particular specialties. No clauses giving my father control over educational decisions. As I read, I found myself wondering what my life might have been like if I'd had this kind of support. If, instead of dismissing my interest in marine biology, my father had established a trust to fund my education. If he'd introduced me to his colleagues in relevant fields, opened doors for me the way he was now doing for Mason. The familiar ache of old resentments surfaced, but alongside it was a new feeling, a determination that Mason would have what I hadn't, that he would pursue his dreams with every possible advantage, even if those advantages came from a source that had once hurt me deeply. The next morning, I called my father. "We've reviewed the trust documents," I said without preamble when he answered. "And?" His voice was carefully neutral. "We're grateful for your generosity," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "Mason is excited about the opportunities this will provide." "I'm pleased to hear that," he replied, and I could hear the genuine relief in his voice. "But there's something we need to be clear about," I continued, drawing on a strength I didn't know I possessed. "This trust is a gift to Mason. It doesn't give you the right to criticize my parenting or my life choices." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "I understand," he said finally. "I'm not sure you do," I pressed on. "Mason has told me about some of your comments regarding my career and life decisions. That stops now. If you want to be a positive influence in his life, which I believe you do, then you need to respect the choices I've made that got him to this point." Another silence, longer this time. I held my breath, half expecting him to withdraw the offer in response to my assertiveness. "You're right," he said finally, the words clearly difficult for him. "I've been unfair in my assessments. You've raised an exceptional young man, Emma. That reflects well on you, not on me." It wasn't quite an apology, but from my father, it was unprecedented acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said, not quite ready to forgive decades of criticism, but willing to accept this small step towards something better. "There's one other thing," my father said. "Vanessa called yesterday. She heard about the trust from James's colleague on the hospital board." Of course she had. News traveled fast in my father's circles. "She's concerned about perceived favoritism." I almost laughed. My sister, who had received every advantage, every support, every approval our father had to give, was worried. About favoritism toward Mason? "What did you tell her?" I asked, curious despite myself. I told her that I was investing in Mason's exceptional potential, the same way I'd invested in her modeling career and James's business ventures, and that if her children demonstrated similar focus and drive, I would support them accordingly. I was speechless. My father had actually defended his support of Mason to his golden child, framing it in terms of merit rather than favoritism or guilt. "That's fair," I managed finally. "I thought so," he replied, a hint of his old confidence returning. "Now, about that MIT summer program. The application deadline is in February, but I've spoken with the director." As my father launched into details about yet another opportunity he was arranging for Mason, I found myself smiling slightly. This new version of my father, still controlling, still convinced he knew best, but now channeling those traits in support of my son rather than against my choices, would take some getting used to. But for Mason's sake, and perhaps for the possibility of healing old wounds between my father and me, I was willing to try. That evening, I sat down with Mason to share the outcome of my conversation with his grandfather. "So we're accepting?" he asked, his expression a mixture of excitement and lingering concern. "Yes," I said, "but with clear boundaries. Your grandfather has agreed to respect our family unit and my parenting decisions." Mason nodded, clearly relieved. "Good, because I want his help with school, but not if it makes you uncomfortable." I pulled him into a hug, marveling at the emotional intelligence of this child I'd somehow raised. "We're a team, you and I. That doesn't change no matter who. Else becomes part of our lives." He hugged me back tightly. "I know, Mom. We always will be." Over the following months, a new pattern emerged in our lives. My father became a regular presence, calling weekly, attending Mason's science competitions, arranging meetings with medical school professors and neurosurgeons who could offer advice and mentorship. To my surprise, he began to extend his interest beyond Mason's academic pursuits to other aspects of our lives. He asked about my work, sometimes offering business contacts for patients needing services beyond physical therapy. He had his gardener deliver plants for our small apartment balcony after Mason mentioned my long-ago interest in biology. Small gestures, awkward sometimes, but genuine in their intent. Vanessa remained cool, clearly resentful of the attention her father now lavished on Mason. But even she grudgingly acknowledged his talent when he won the state science fair with a project on neural regeneration after traumatic injury. As winter turned to spring, I watched my son flourish under this new constellation of support. His confidence grew, not with arrogance, but with the quiet assurance of someone who knows they are on the right path. His compassion deepened as his hospital volunteering brought him into contact with patients facing neurological challenges. And most remarkably, he remained unchanged at his core. Still thoughtful, still kind, still the boy who saw value in people beyond their status or achievements. One evening in April, as we sat on our balcony among the plants my father had sent, Mason looked up from his biology textbook with a pensive expression. "Mom, do you think people can really change? Like, fundamentally change who they are?" I considered the question, thinking of my father's evolution over the past months. "I think people can grow," I said carefully. "They can expand their perspective, develop new priorities. The core of who they are might remain the same, but how they express that core can transform." Mason nodded, processing this. "Grandpa is different now. Not completely different, but it's like he's using the same skills he always had, but for different purposes." "That's an insightful way to put it," I agreed. "Your grandfather has always been strategic, driven, focused on achievement. Now he's applying those traits to supporting your goals, rather than just his own agenda." "Do you think he regrets how he treated you?" Mason asked, the question so direct it momentarily took my breath away. I looked out at the twilight skyline, considering how to answer honestly without burdening my son with adult complexities. "I think he's beginning to recognize that his narrow definition of success limited his relationship with me," I said finally. "Whether that's the same as regret, I'm not sure. Your grandfather isn't very comfortable with emotional reflection." Mason smiled slightly. "Yeah, I noticed that. Whenever I thank him for something, he changes the subject right away." I laughed, recognizing the characteristic avoidance. "That's Richard Harrington in a nutshell." I shook my head in amazement. "You've changed this family, you know that? In ways I never could." He looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I didn't do anything special. I just kept working toward what I wanted." "That persistence in the face of doubt is exactly what's special," I insisted. "You refuse to let other people's limitations define your possibilities." The following weekend, we arrived at Vanessa and James's expansive home in one of Connecticut's most exclusive neighborhoods. I'd been here only a handful of times over. The years, always feeling out of place among the designer furniture and expensive art. Today was no different, but there was a new dimension to my discomfort, a sense that this gathering represented a significant shift in family dynamics I wasn't entirely prepared for. To my surprise, the entire extended family was present, not just my father and Vanessa's family, but Uncle Dale and Aunt Patricia, cousins I rarely saw, even my father's sister Elizabeth, who had flown in from Chicago. They greeted Mason with enthusiasm and me with a new warmth that left me slightly disoriented. "Stanford!" Uncle Dale boomed, clapping Mason on the shoulder. "Richard hasn't talked about anything else all week." "We're all so proud," Aunt Patricia added, squeezing my hand in a rare gesture of affection. What an accomplishment! Dinner was served in Vanessa's formal dining room, the table set with fine china and crystal that made me nervous just looking at it. My father sat at one end of the table, Vanessa at the other, with Mason and me seated in positions of honor, near the center. It was, I realized with a jolt, exactly the opposite of where we would have been placed just a few years ago. The least important guests relegated to the furthest seats. As the main course was being served, my father stood and tapped his glass for attention. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to him expectantly. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he'd used in business meetings throughout my childhood. "To Mason, whose acceptance to Stanford represents not just academic achievement, but the kind of determination and vision that defines true success." Glasses were raised around the table, accompanied by murmurs of agreement. My father wasn't finished, however. "4 years ago," he continued, "when Mason first shared his ambition to become a neurosurgeon, I made a grave error. I dismissed his dream as unrealistic. I failed to recognize the exceptional young man sitting before me." He paused, his gaze moving deliberately to meet mine. "And I failed to acknowledge the remarkable job his mother had done raising him." A hushed silence fell over the table. My father had never publicly acknowledged any mistake, let alone one involving his assessment of me. "Emma," he said, addressing me directly now, "raised Mason to believe in his capabilities, to work with focus and integrity, to persist despite obstacles. These qualities, far more than any financial support or connections I may have provided, later are the foundation of his success." I felt tears threatening and blinked rapidly, unwilling to cry in front of this family that had so often witnessed my humiliation but rarely my triumph. "So today," my father concluded, "we celebrate not just Mason's achievement, but the journey that brought him here. A journey guided by his mother's wisdom and supported, belatedly but wholeheartedly, by all of us. To Mason and Emma." "To Mason and Emma," the table echoed, raising their glasses. I took a sip of wine to hide my emotion, hardly able to believe what I had just witnessed. My father had not only praised Mason, but had publicly credited me for his success, an acknowledgement I had never expected to receive. Beside me, Mason squeezed my hand under the table, a silent recognition of the significance of this moment. I squeezed back, grateful beyond words for this extraordinary young man who had somehow managed to heal wounds I'd thought would remain painful forever. As dessert was served, the conversation flowed more naturally than I could ever remember. At a family gathering, Uncle Dale asked Mason thoughtful questions about his research interests. Aunt Patricia shared stories of her brother, my father, as a determined young man, drawing parallels to Mason's focus. Even Vanessa seemed genuinely engaged, asking about Stanford's campus and programs without a hint of her usual competitiveness. When the evening ended, my father walked us to our car, an unusual gesture that signaled this night was different from ordinary family dinners. "I meant what I said in there," he told me, as Mason loaded his jacket into the back seat. "You did what I couldn't, Emma. You saw potential where I saw only limitation. You believed when I doubted. I sighed, conflicted. I don't know. It seems indulgent somehow. I have my practice, my patience. Mom, Mason said, sitting beside me on the bed. You've spent the last 18 years putting my needs first. Maybe it's time to consider your own dreams too. It's more complicated than that, I protested. Starting over in a new field at my age. You're 37, not 70, he interrupted with a laugh. And you're not starting over completely. You already have a science background, a bachelor's degree. This is building on what you know, not abandoning it. His logic was sound as always. Still, I hesitated. What if I'm no good at it? What if I've romanticized marine biology all these years and the reality is nothing like I imagined? Then you'll know, he said simply. Better to try and discover it's not for you than to wonder forever what might have been. The wisdom in his words struck me deeply. How many times had I given him similar advice about taking chances, embracing opportunities, being willing to fail in pursuit of something meaningful? When did you get so smart? I asked, echoing a question I'd posed many times throughout his childhood. He grinned. I had a good teacher. We completed our journey to Stanford that day, arriving on campus amid the controlled chaos of move-in day. As we unpacked Mason's belongings in his dorm room, arranged his books on shelves, made his bed with the new extra-long twin sheets we'd purchased, I felt the familiar bittersweet ache of an ending overlapping with a beginning. When everything was finally in place, we stood in the center of the small room, suddenly awkward in the face of our imminent separation. I guess this is it, Mason said, his voice thick with emotion he rarely displayed. I guess so, I agreed, fighting back. Tears. You're going to be amazing here, you know that, right? He nodded, then pulled me into a fierce hug. I wouldn't be here without you, Mom, not just because you raised me, but because you showed me what it looks like to believe in something even when everyone else says it's impossible. I held him tightly, this remarkable young man who had once been my baby, who had grown into someone who not only pursued his own dreams, but encouraged others to reclaim theirs. I filled out that application, I admitted quietly. Last night, after you went to sleep. I'm going to submit it when I get home. He pulled back to look at me, his face lighting up with a smile that reminded me of the little boy who had once been so excited about dinosaurs that he could barely contain himself. Really? Mom, that's fantastic. It's just an application, I cautioned. I might not even get in. But you're trying, he insisted. That's what matters. That's what you always taught me. As I drove away from Stanford that afternoon, leaving a piece of my heart behind in that dorm room, I felt a strange mixture of loss and possibility. The application packet sat on the passenger seat where Mason had been, a tangible reminder that endings could also be beginnings, that dreams deferred need not be dreams abandoned. 2 months later, on a crisp October evening, I found myself once again at my father's house for a family dinner. Vanessa and her family were there, along with Uncle Dale and Aunt Patricia. Mason was absent, of course, deep into his first semester at Stanford, though he joined briefly via video call to share updates about his classes and research opportunities. After the call ended, my father cleared his throat and raised his glass. I'd like to propose a toast, he announced, to new beginnings. All eyes turned to me, and I felt a flush of self-consciousness. Word had spread through the family about my acceptance to the Marine Conservation Studies program, which I had started just 3 weeks earlier. To Emma, my father continued, who is proving that it's never too late to pursue a passion, and who taught all of us an important lesson about persistence through her example. As glasses were raised around the table, I felt a sense of coming full circle. 4 years ago, at a similar family gathering, Mason had announced his dream of becoming a neurosurgeon, only to be met with dismissal and laughter. Today, he was thriving at Stanford, laying the groundwork for that very career. And I was finally pursuing the interest I had abandoned decades ago, supported by the very family members who had once defined success so narrowly. "I've been thinking," Vanessa said after the toast, her tone lacking its usual competitive edge, "about what you said last time we talked, Emma, about measuring success by impact rather than status. It's made me reconsider some things with Olivia." Her daughter, now 15, had been modeling since childhood, largely driven by Vanessa's ambitions rather than her own interests. "She mentioned wanting to volunteer at that animal shelter you told her about," Vanessa continued. I think she might benefit from exploring different paths, finding what truly resonates with her." I nodded, touched by this unexpected opening. "The shelter always needs help. I could take her next weekend if she's interested." Vanessa smiled, a genuine expression without the usual undercurrent of competition. She'd like that. As the evening continued, I found myself engaging with my family in a way that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Not as the disappointing daughter or the struggling single mother, but as someone worthy of respect, someone with valuable perspectives to offer. Later, as my father walked me to my car, he seemed uncharacteristically reflective. "You know," he said, gazing up at the stars visible in the clear Connecticut sky, "I've spent most of my life believing there was only one path to success. One way to measure a life's value." I waited, sensing he had more to say. "Mason changed that perspective," he continued. "And by extension, you did too. Showing me that determination, clarity of purpose, and integrity matter more than the specific path one chooses." It was as close to an apology for his decades of criticism as I was likely to get, and somehow it was enough. "Thank you for the application," I said, gesturing toward my car where my marine biology textbooks were stacked on the passenger seat. "It's been illuminating to return to something I loved and set aside." He nodded, pleased but trying not to show it too openly. "How are the classes?" "Challenging," I admitted. "The science has advanced significantly since I last studied. But fascinating. Absolutely fascinating." "And your practice?" "I've reduced my hours slightly to accommodate the course schedule. My patients have been surprisingly supportive. Some have even taken an interest in my studies, asking questions about local marine ecosystems when they come in for therapy." My father smiled, a rare, genuine expression without calculation or restraint. "I'm proud of you, Emma. I should have said that more often over the years." The words I had longed to hear throughout my childhood and adult life, finally spoken at age 37. They meant more than I could express. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 4 years. From a family reunion where dreams were mocked to a family dinner where new pursuits were celebrated. From a relationship with my father defined by criticism and disappointment to one characterized by growing respect and support. From a life constrained by others' expectations to one expanding with new possibilities. All because a 14-year-old boy had refused to let laughter diminish his dreams, had stood his ground with research and determination when faced with dismissal, had silenced a room with his quiet confidence in his own potential. Mason's journey was just beginning at Stanford, the long road to becoming a neurosurgeon stretching before him with its challenges and rewards. My own journey was taking an unexpected turn, returning to an abandoned passion with new perspective and purpose. And perhaps most remarkably, my father's journey had shifted too, from rigid certainty about what constituted success to a more nuanced understanding of fulfillment and worth. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone pinged with a text from Mason. "Just aced my neuroscience midterm. How was family dinner? Did you tell them about the coastal research project you got selected for?" I smiled, typing back. "Dinner was good. Different. Told them about the project. Even Vanessa seemed impressed. So proud of you, genius. Get some sleep." His response came immediately. "Proud of you too, Mom. We're both exactly where we're supposed to be." I sat in my car for a moment, letting the truth of those words sink in. We were indeed where we were meant to be, not because the path had been easy or straight, but because we had persisted through doubt and dismissal, had refused to let others' limitations define our possibilities. And in doing so, we had not only transformed our own lives, but had shifted the perspectives of those around us, creating space for new definitions of success, new appreciation for different forms of achievement, new understanding of what truly constitutes a life well lived. From mockery to admiration, from dismissal to respect, from limitation to possibility, the journey had been challenging, but the destination was proving to be more rewarding than I could have imagined. As I entered our apartment, now filled with marine biology textbooks alongside the physical therapy journals, I felt a sense of contentment I had rarely experienced. This was not the life I had envisioned for myself at 20 or 30 or even 35. It was something different, something unexpected, a blend of established expertise and new exploration, of professional accomplishment and personal growth. It was, I realized, exactly what I had always wanted for Mason. Not a life defined by others' expectations, but one shaped by his own passions, strengths, and determination. Somehow, in supporting his dreams, I had found my way back to my own. And in that synchronicity was a lesson worth sharing, that it's never too late to reclaim abandoned aspirations. That persistent belief in possibility can transform not just one life, but many, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves and others is the courage to say, "This is my dream. It matters. And I will pursue it, even if you laugh, even if you doubt, even if the path is longer and harder than I initially imagined. Because in the end, it's not the absence of obstacles that defines us, but the determination with which we face them. And sometimes, the dreams that meet the most resistance are the ones most worth fighting for." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.